Never, ever pretend for a moment that your enemies that wish you harm are not doing the exact same thing. Never once. Guys, we're going to talk about men's issues, but I want to read a message that was sent to me. Now, I'm not going to be saying this person's name because anonymity is important, but I do want to read this message because I think it's important for what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to read this before we get into the fan art section, and then we're going to move on from there. But I got a message today saying, "Hey, Suris, I really wanted to say thank you. Your video on men's issues really made me feel seen. I'm a trans man, and I've been out only a bit over a year, and only to my boyfriend and select friends. I've been struggling with my gender, in hindsight, for 15 years. For me, the men are trash and kill all men all kept me closeted for several years. I felt a deep internal sadness akin to, I don't want to be a bad person, even if I was an egg. It's something pushing me back into the closet with how drastic the men hate has gotten. It's made me scared to start medically transitioning, far more than the transphobia does. Day in and day out, at least within my circle since about 2010, when I started using the internet more often, I've seen women praised for existing, their bodies being uplifted, reassurance that their mistakes don't define them, just endless positivity towards them. But I see endless hate and anger towards men, and I'm scared. I am very, very left, and I don't even feel safe in spaces that are supposed to accept me. Again, thank you. I feel seen for the first time ever in this. And you mentioning that it's a small but extremely loud minority acting like this really did help me feel better." So, the reason that I read that, the reason that I do that, is for every single person who gave me pushback about talking about men's issues, in a progressive sense, I have received something like that. I want to make sure that when we're here on this side of the political aisle and we are talking about social issues that we need to be focusing on, that we are including people who matter. People who otherwise feel ostracized by some of the more flippant language that we've engaged in. And yeah, even I've engaged in this flippant language before, just sometimes with other things. But let's get into the fan art section first, and then we will get into the actual topic at hand. The first one we have here is from Quizzle. I was looking through my Critta files, and I found this goober. Sanic Slime Suris. The next one we have here is from Harley Quinn, and said, "Suris has a balloon that looks like him in slime cat form. The word in the picture says, oh my, there's a balloon that looks like me as a cat. I was bored, and I wanted to draw." Aw, well, thank you very much. As always, everybody, I appreciate all the fan art that is submitted. If you want your fan art to be shown in a future video, the best way to do so is to drop it into the fan art section of the Discord. But with that said, this is a video that was sent to me, and it's a recent one. Came out February of this year, and it's called "Why the Rate of Single Men in the U.S. That Are Looking for Dates Has Declined." Let's go ahead and take a listen.
Last week, I delved here into recent data from the CDC suggesting major problems with regard to the mental health of our adolescents, surges in depression, and suicidal ideation, especially true for our girls. This week, I found cause to worry about young men. This headline from The Hill, it caught my eye. Most young men are single, most young women are not. The story reported that as of 2022, Pew Research Center found 30% of U.S. adults are neither married, living with a partner, nor engaged in a committed relationship. Nearly half of all young adults are single. Now, look at these numbers. 34% of women, twice as many, a whopping 63% of men. What explains that?
What explains that one right there? Very good question. Let's see.
Pulled the Pew study and I read with interest. Turns out since 2019, the share of single men who say they're looking for dates or a relationship has declined from 61% to 50%. In 2018, 28% of men ages 18 to 30 reported they'd had no sex in the past year, compared with 18% of women of that age. The Hill report said men in their 20s are more likely than women in their 20s to be romantically uninvolved, sexually dormant, friendless, and lonely.
So, Do you remember when I did my video? Not citing any data, just shooting from the hip on how I felt on men's issues, where I pointed out the specific type of person that is very easy to recruit into a far-right cult. Do you remember that type of person? I mentioned a person who didn't have a loving relationship, a person who felt lonely, a person who felt ostracized. Do you maybe think that this person that's being described in the study right here, do you maybe think that this person right here is the exact kind of person that can easily be brought down the alt-right pipeline? Do you think maybe, possibly, there is even the slightest chance that this is a person that's very vulnerable to incredibly pro-masculine rhetoric that also happens to have all of the toxic masculinity wrapped into it, that ends up burgeoning out into anti-gay and anti-trans rhetoric? Do you maybe think that this type of person is vulnerable to a certain contingent on the right that is financially dependent on making this lonely, sad person feel heard, feel welcomed, feel like they're willing to spend their money on a content creator who is hearing them? This is a game for them, and it's a game I know very, very well. There are people in this audience right now, people who are watching this exact moment, who have donated to the stream solely because they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel like what I'm doing here is creating a space that makes them feel more at home, makes them feel safer. There are people that are willing to donate to content creators who are building those spaces for them. Never, ever pretend for a moment that your enemies that wish you harm are not doing the exact same thing. Never once. Let's continue.
They stand at the vanguard of an epidemic of declining marriage.
Speaking of which, thank you very much, Rock Hopper Fluffy Boy, for the 69 bits, and Ultra Fine Point for the 100 bits.
Sexuality and relationships that afflicts all of young America. Among the causes, among the factors, a reliance on social media and online porn. But also, more young women are hooking up with each other or dating and marrying slightly older men, and heterosexual women are getting more choosy. Other troubling statistics about men come from a 2021 study from the Survey Center for American Life. They found the share of men who have 6 or more close friends, which in 1990 was 55%, by 2021 had shrunk by half. Meanwhile, those with literally 0 close friends, which stood at 3% in 1990, has zoomed to 15%.
So, do you remember when I did a video about second places and third places? Do you remember when I talked about the ability or the reason it was so important for you to go out and meet people and make friends? Do you remember that? I sincerely hope every one of you does. Anyone who's watched most of my content, which, I mean, dear God, the fact that you've managed to stomach all of it. Do you want to know why I made that content? Because there's an easy way to insulate yourself from people who would want to prey on you in your most vulnerable state, and that is to make yourself less vulnerable. The way to make yourself less vulnerable socially is to create a social group. A group of people around you that you trust. A group of people around you that have your back. A group of people that say, if you need to demolish an entire floor in your kitchen and rebuild it from the ground up because you didn't build it right the first time and pets have literally destroyed the subfloor, are willing to come and help you do that because they're your friend and they know you'd do the same for them. It's a really helpful thing to keep in mind. No fucking lie. The statistic tell me men feel expendable, and that's kind of been internalized. Yeah, believe me, a lot of us do. I've been in a relationship for the majority of my life. From age 15 till December, there were very, very brief stints where I was not in some kind of relationship. And that insulated me a little bit from a lot of this. I didn't get to feel the crippling loneliness the way that most people do, because I've always been able to find a partner. I've never had an issue finding a partner. So it takes me looking at these studies, looking at stuff like this, and hearing the stories from people who reach out to me to put this into perspective, because it's not my lived experience. That isolating, crushing loneliness, that's never been my experience. But it doesn't have to be my experience for it to be true. It doesn't need to be my experience for it to be something that affects people. Nakibri, thank you for the 100 bits. Finding the furry community pulled me out of the alt-right pipeline before it was too late. Red Joker, thank you for the 101 bits. Taproot says, I don't know if you said this in so many words, but this topic brings to the front something I keep saying. This is why patriarchy and toxic masculinity is harmful to men too. Yeah, some of the aspects of toxic masculinity are not letting people get so close to you, not letting your emotions out to those people, not crying in front of them, and a lot of that can atomize you from people around you. It can make it harder to develop those close friendships. It can make it harder to open up about how you really feel to those people. There's a reason why, and this person's not my friend anymore, but there is a friend that I had that literally, when we would go to play Magic at his house, when he would get intoxicated enough, he would flat out break down and cry because he worked in construction. He worked in an environment that was always telling him that he wasn't man enough. He wasn't good enough. He was expendable. He was a number. He was only as good as he was useful. And the minute that he wasn't useful anymore, then he was expendable. And that was his lived experience, and that was around other guys. This isn't like women are telling you this and oh, whammon bad. No, this is just the environment guys have, even in their own fucking social space. And he would break down and cry after having, the 10th, 11th, 12th drink that night. Because our group, our friend group that we played Magic with, was the only group of people that he had ever experienced that were willing to sit down and fucking just listen to him. Just listen. That's all. Not fix any issues, not offer solutions, just listen. Just be there. Just be an open conduit that can hear that pain. That was something that was so fucking rare to this person. And they were almost 40. That means from adulthood, this person was dealing with almost 20 years of this shit with no proper outlet. They are common. That is the norm. I don't know how many times I have to tell you that a space like mine or Vosh's or Shark's, these are considered rarities compared to what you normally see in the outside world. Felicia Angel, thank you for the 500 bits and the 100 bits. And Waffle Apocalypse, thank you for the 510 bits. Apparently we started a hype train when I'm in the middle of a fucking rant. Let's go ahead and continue.
An expert quoted by The Hill said this disconnect can have catastrophic consequences for young men. Quote, in the worst case scenario, the young American man's social disconnect can have tragic consequences. Young men commit suicide at 4 times the rate of young women. Younger women are largely responsible for rising rates of mass shootings, a trend that some researchers link to their growing social isolation. Well, those words reminded me of a conversation that I had over a year ago right here on CNN with NYU professor Scott Galloway.
Before we get into that, Agamotto, thank you for the 400 bits, or the 40 bits, and Felicia Angel, thank you for the 400 bits. And Caldifer, thank you for the 100 bits as well. Jesus Christ, y'all are just edging that hype train up. I appreciate it. I really do. But again, this is why I want to start tackling these types of issues more, because when people don't have those kinds of spaces where they're able to be a guy, be as masculine as they want to be, but also be healthy and positive and all that shit, that isolation increases. And literally, we're seeing from this, that data is there. That isolation has been increasing. It's been increasing over the last several years. Amorous Felgun, thank you very much for the 1,000 bits. So we care about these issues. Thank you for covering them.
But the issue is, when you have a group of men, the lower half of attractiveness of men in online dating, which has doubled, now it's about half of relationships, and the top 20% of men in terms of attractiveness get about 60% of the interest, you end up with a group of men that are more prone to conspiracy theory, more prone to misogynistic content, more prone to not believe in climate change. So
do you know what they just described there? Do you know what was just described there? That one right there. There's a word for that ideology. You probably already know what it is. I can change the words around a little bit and you'll recognize it instantly. Change the word, or change the term, top 50% of attractiveness, top 20% of attractiveness, change that word to Chad. And all of a sudden, you've created an incel. You have created the exact type of person who will embody an ideology that will destroy them and will become a self-fulfilling prophecy for them. The reality is that, yes, people who are attractive get dates more often. People who are on dating apps where we are seeing just the superficial picture of a person and that's it, they will get dates more often. What we do with that information is important. Yes, there are people who are demisexual and don't see that first. But again, on places like Tinder, that's not what you're seeing. You're seeing a picture of a person. You're seeing whatever version of themselves they're throwing on the internet. When people start to feel more atomized and more isolated, they look at that reality and they develop that ideology of incelness, where all of a sudden a statistical probability factor that we've known for fucking years becomes the Chad, and the Chad becomes their enemy, and the Chad becomes the person who they look at on the social hierarchy as obtaining all of the products that they want because they want to obtain women. Not date them, not love them, not be in a relationship with them. They see them as status symbols, and Chad as obtaining more status symbols than them. This is what happens when you look at a statistical reality, and you have people on places like Poll, on places like B on 4chan, on places like Joe Rogan's podcast, who are willing to take that information and build up an ideology. Now, should be noted, historically, incel ideology began on forums, forum culture. And there have been testimonials from people who have been part of incel groups for the longest time that a lot of those groups began as positive spaces. They began as spaces for people to create community around themselves instead of isolating themselves. But we all know what it's turned into. We all know how it's changed. The fact of the matter is, those spaces have been appropriated by people who would rather find that lonely person and use them as an opportunity. And you can bet your damn ass people like Andrew Tate, people like Mark Dice, people like Ben Shapiro, they see that isolation as an opportunity. And so discourse gets sown in there. Now the idea of the Chad transforms into Chad and the Tracy, and the common rhetoric of, girls don't want to date nice guys because a girl once told me that I'm a nice guy, but when you should be recognizing that that was somebody trying desperately to let you down soft. They weren't telling you you're nice and therefore they want to date somebody who's not nice. But that's not the conversation that happens. The conversation that happens there is Chad morphs from the attractive person to the attractive person who's also an asshole and therefore is not deserving of the Tracy or the whatever name they want to put there. And again, this deserving of person rhetoric starts to objectify women more, and it turns them more into status symbols, more into things to be obtained, not people to have a relationship. And when this culture of person starts to feed itself, when the people in this once supportive network of people start feeding each other this kind of information over and over again, then you get a whole bunch of guys who are just assholes to women because they can't get dates. And that person, once you've created that person, that's the person who slots super evenly, super well into the Andrew Tate audience, into the Shapiro audience, into the Walsh audience. They slot into that so fucking easily because they've been cultivated for it at that point.
This is the American story. If it's written with a pen whose ink is failing young men, does not end well. This is an existential crisis, failing young men.
As always, Professor Galloway was prescient. Back with me now is Scott Galloway. He's a professor of marketing at NYU Stern School of Business. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's the host of the Professor G podcast and author of multiple best-selling books, most recently, Adrift, America in 100 Charts. Scott, thanks for returning. Hasn't the advantage always been to those with the looks and or the money? What's changed?
First off, Michael, I just want to say thank you for raising this issue a year ago when a lot of media companies were afraid to talk about this for fear of it being pro-men was somehow being anti-women. Look,
and to be fair, there's actually a little bit of validity to that. So now we have to talk about another space that gets generated from this, because there's the incel space that gets generated from this, and then there's the men's rights activism space that gets generated from this. The men's rights activism space is largely a toxic subspace of the internet. It's super fucking toxic. It creates this men versus women dichotomy more than anything else. So what happens is when you start talking about men's issues, you start sounding like a men's rights activist. And when you start sounding like a men's rights activist, people will rightly look at you and go, that's a bit sussy. That's a bit weird. Are you like all of the other people in that space that are toxic as shit? But that's the hand we're dealt right now. We've got to work with it. You got to work with it.
This is returning to the natural order of things. For the majority of history, a small percentage of men have had the majority of the mating opportunities. But in America, we decided to make a huge investment and what would probably be the greatest innovation in history, and that is in the middle class. From 1945 to 1947, 7 million men returned from war were discharged from the service, and we decided to give them the GI Bill, subsidized mortgages. We saw education rates go from 5 to 45%. They were valued, and we had such a strong manufacturing base that you had massive marriage and household formation. And some men were seen as more economically and emotionally viable. And you've seen the reverse happen with the offshoring of much of our manufacturing base.
So using terms like mating opportunities, it does give the ick, and I wholly understand that. At the same time, though, when you're talking about this, men and women are both being seen as mechanical pieces of the mating ritual, not one person being thought of as the breeder or the other. It's good to recognize when the rhetoric is not that way. But no, the mating opportunity thing it sits awkwardly with me as well, but it also reads as purely clinical.
With a society that, quite frankly, doesn't value young men. When we talk about problems with people of color or women, we see it as a systemic societal problem. When we see problems or the stats that you just mentioned, we see it as accountability, or that men just need to level up. But married households and household formation are better citizens. They vote. They save at twice the rate. They're less likely to commit crimes. And we have fewer and fewer viable men. We have a dearth of economically and emotionally viable men. But the middle class is an accident. Unless you invest in it, it doesn't happen. Eisenhower decided to invest $500 billion in a national highway project that created tons of jobs. We have, and by the way, the tax rate back then was 91%. We raised money and we redistributed in social programs that made young people more economically viable.
Boy, howdy. Look at that. How many times have I been saying that we should be raising fucking taxes on people who are making the most goddamn money? It's almost as if everything comes full circle. You know, it's kind of funny when you try to have the libertarian idea of, oh, let's get rid of taxes, let's do all this, let's lower the amount of social programs people have access to. You end up magnifying men's issues. You end up magnifying everyone's issues too, but you know.
And then, Scott, you toss in the influence of social media and how relationships today, they don't come from, in our era, happenstance and mingling, right? They come from swiping, and that further accelerates this issue. Am I right?
Oh, it's been the chaser to it. I mean, to have an honest conversation about this, we have to be honest, and that is that men and women have different mating criteria. One quarter of men saying economic viability is a key criteria in a mate. 3/4 of women say that is important. And when you're on a two-dimensional format, where now it's 1 and 2 relationships begin online, it used to be 1 and 4 just a few years ago, it gets distilled down to a small number of criteria. Specifically for men, it's does she look attractive? And specifically for men, is he able to signal his ability to garner resources in the future? An average attractive male on...
Bear in mind, this is based off of survey data. This is based off poll data. So when people were asking for the data on that, the studies on that, hey, can you show that there's actually a disparity between how men experience dating websites and how women experience dating websites? Yes, there is. And I don't know how many times I need to say that that disparity is something that the right wing likes to prey upon. They like to turn it into an us versus them issue. They like to do that, as opposed to doing the standard thing of accepting the reality of the situation and then finding workarounds for it within yourself. They like to say, this is the reality of the situation. Here's an enemy we can point you at with a stick.
Tinder gets swiped less than 1% of the time, and there's 3 men on Tinder for every 1 woman. So you've distilled it, you've taken out one of the key components of mating dynamics, and that is vibe, humor, body language, pheromones, the ability...
There's a reason I want to pause here. So, when you're on a dating profile, and I mentioned that attractiveness was the thing that people are using more often, and when you think about people who you might want to date. I'm demisexual, so it's very hard for me to get anything other than this person's probably attractive, I think. The minute I talk with somebody, I can start figuring out what my attraction level to them is, but before that conversation, I can't. It's just not, it doesn't work out very well for me. When you go out and you have a conversation with somebody, you start getting that data yourself. You start figuring out, oh, this is a person I like being around. You can never know if you like being around somebody just from their picture. That would literally require magic. So what we have here is a situation where if the criteria that more women are using requires that conversation, and the criteria that most men are using doesn't, that's the reason why you get men who are just swiping right on anybody who shows up. All they care about is the person attractive, or do they have a good face showing forward, statistically, like as a matter of amount of people here. So when you swiped right 1,000 times and you haven't hit a match on Tinder or Bumble or OkCupid or whatever you happen to be using, do you think that might make you feel a little isolated? Do you think that might make you maybe just a smidge vulnerable? Just a little bit.
Ability to be, quite frankly, a little bit persistent in the pursuit of a romantic relationship. We have no third places anymore. No.
Hey, boy, howdy! There's that fucking term I talked about! There's that thing I advocated for! Holy fucking shit! It's almost as if... Well, I'm not gonna go there. That would be gloating. Let's continue.
Places to meet. People aren't going to bars, they aren't sports league, they aren't going to church, they aren't even going to work. So it gets distilled down to very one or two dimensional attributes. And the reality is women are much choosier than men, and they can apply those screens, and they allocate all of their attention to a small number of men that results in just essentially at the end of the day, a lack of opportunities. Chris Williams summarized it perfectly. He called it the high heels effect. In the last 40 years, more women have graduated from college than men, and they're not interested in mating with non-college grads. They now own more homes, single women, than single men. So what you have is women say they won't date anyone shorter than them, 50% of them. Effectively, what you have metaphorically over the last 40 years is women have been getting taller and taller. And
also, yeah, no, the functionality of a church is it is a social group that you can go to. That's what it is. That is its function. Now, there's other baggage that comes with church specifically, but if I were to talk about just in practical senses what it is a mixed gendered space where multiple people in a small geographical location can congregate. There's a lot of people who are atheistic and will still go to church just for the sociability. I'm not saying it's a good or bad idea. I'm largely against indoctrination, but that is its function. Like within social conversation, that's what it is for. Kid City German says, did he seriously say mating, or am I mishearing things? No, he's saying mating. He's saying mating because what he's doing is he is talking about this in terms of only the clinical psychological aspect of it. So boiling people down to potential mates. This is what you do when you're looking at raw data. When you're looking at raw data, you tend to boil things down to terminology that it is very, very clinical. It's very, very attached. But if you're used to that conversation happening in a very personal sense, then it's very easy to take that verbiage and feel slighted by it because it feels like you're being boiled down to just a biological function. But when we're looking at raw data, that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to boil things down to their most simplistic state so we can read it. We can't get 10 billion individual human stories when we're looking at data, but we can get an idea about the simple aspects of what's going on. Yeah, this is just how the term is used here.
Men have been getting shorter and shorter. How many of us have said, I know a ton of great single women, they can't find a date? That's not true. They can't find a date. They can't find a man they find economically or emotionally viable. If we don't make a massive investment in young people and make more economically and emotionally viable men, we're going to see a lack of household formation. We're going to see a decline in the middle class. And we're going to see, quite frankly, just a lot of young men who are terrible citizens.
So is the answer to fix this economically, and who will champion this conversation? You felt obliged to compliment me at the outset because we had engaged on this a year ago, and here I am revisiting it. And I read into that the fact that you think that it's politically incorrect even to have this dialogue.
So before he even answers, I want to say the fact that I even had to have a fight on the video when I talked about men's issues with an active chatter kind of signals exactly what he's talking about. Just saying, just throwing that out there.
When you're seen as advocating for men because of the 300,000 year head start we've had, it seems somehow as anti-female. There's a
Hey, look, even pointing out that largely, for the majority of time, we have had that advantage. We do live in a patriarchal system. That patriarchal system also happens to be failing its men.
There's a lot of very unfortunate misogyny online that is masquerading as being pro-men. A lot of TikTok celebrities who talk about advocating for men. It's just thinly veiled misogyny. What do we need? We need more freshman seats in colleges.
Hey, look, he even recognized that there are people in social spaces who are using the men's advocacy as a network to just talk about misogyny. Boy, howdy, it's so fucking weird that the people who study this are saying the same thing I said in the video that I ended up having a fucking fight on. It's just weird. It's just so strange. But okay.
We need a massive investment in vocational training. We need to figure out a way to get more permitting for housing so young people can afford housing. We need to recognize our economic policies, literally allocate wealth from young people to old people. The percentage of wealth that young people control under the age of 40 has been cut from 12% to 6%. These are concerted, deliberate decisions. We did away with the child tax credit. We don't want to make it any easier for people to have kids, but seniors just got their largest cost of living adjustment increase in history. We have made the decision to make it harder and more expensive for people to find each other, for people to mate, and for people to have children. And without children, we turn into Japan and Italy, and that is we go into population decline and our economy goes into decline. We are about to become a society by the turn of the century. There will be 8 times as many people over the age of 60 and half as many kids under the age of 5. Nursery schools will become these strange situations with old people staring through fences at these creatures they don't see in the wild called children. Is this the world we want?
So while he's being very hyperbolic there, I should note that there is a phenomenon that happens when a country's population goes into decline, or at least its ability to have a replacement population. I believe, Americans have a replacement rate in their own population of, 1.6? And you need 2.2 for population viability, which means we require immigration in order to supplement our population. It's literally a thing that is statistically required. So anytime somebody's like being anti-immigration because they're worried about fucking white genocide or some shit, your country is not viable without it. Holy shit, stop being a racist. It's insane. One of the reasons that we have such a low rate of people who are having kids is, honestly, it's just not financially viable for a lot of people. Hell, in my situation, as a content creator, I am making more as a content creator now than I have at any other point in my life. Well, let me scratch that. I've made more as a content creator at other points in my life, but this position is the one that has made me more financially stable. This is one that has made it to where I'm able to own a house, own a car that I'm not having to work on every fucking 3 weeks. I'm able to go to conventions to meet other people who are in the same spaces as I am. This is something that was made possible by this, and even with that added stability that I now have, I can't think about kids. I don't make enough for that shit. I don't know if I'm ever going to make enough for that shit. But that's the reality of the situation there. Now, this is not saying that, people should be having more kids. There's no moral dilemma here. Again, when you don't have replacement population in the country, all you do is you just supplement with immigration. That's what you do. That's how you solve that problem. That's how we have solved that problem historically. As American population rates go down, for people who are living, born, and raised here, immigration rates go up, and those allow us to maintain people who are in our economic workforce. That's just functionally how that works. And yeah, that may sound detached. It may sound like it's taking people and boiling them down to what they can provide to the capitalist machine. That's unfortunately what happens when you're talking about raw data. People become numbers when you're talking about raw data. And it sucks, but we still have to talk about the data. It is important to talk about the data. Even me just spoiling my nieces, that's a lot of money. Yep. So what was it? Babies. The price per month to have a child is $900 for the first 3 years. $900 a month, if memory serves. Correct me on that if I'm wrong, but that's the price of healthcare for the child. That's the price of food. That's the price of clothing. That's the price of diapers. That's the price of that's the first 5 years. That's before you get into buying them expensive things. That's before you get into taking them to extra extracurricular activities. That price actually goes up the older that you get, not down. So we need both the cold data and the compassion for our fellow human beings. Yep. So how do you make it to where people are able to do that? It's a multifaceted thing. You have to create an environment where people are able to socialize together so they can create the relationships that create the children, but you also need to create an environment where the people who are getting and engaging in those relationships can even support themselves in the first place. There are people who want to be stay-at-home dads and stay-at-home moms, and they literally can't because two people are required in so many cases in order to keep a household surviving. The rent in several places is upwards of fucking $1,000. And that's not places like New York City. That's places like Cartersville, Georgia. Places that do not need to have that kind of fucking... sorry, I've lived in Cartersville before. I can assure you, there is nothing about Cartersville that deserves to be $1,000 a month. Not a damn thing. But you just simply do not have a conversation about this without some type of backlash. Asher says there are places with rent under 1K. I live in the middle of nowhere. My rent is $900 a month. Anti-Vaven says my 1 bed, 1 bath where I live is $1,300 a month. Yep, it's crazy. It's insane. This is not an environment where you can have the things that, let's just go ahead and flat out say it. Isn't it strange how the right wing of politics, most of the time, almost always advocates for having that traditional lifestyle, that traditional sit down and have a partner and raise kids lifestyle. And then the economic reality is that that's not a thing that can happen. And then that economic reality is literally fed by the right wing, which then makes people that are voting for right-wing legislation constantly having to rely more and more parasocially on their right-wing punditry and their right-wing politicians that they believe are going to claw them out while they are advocating for the policies that keep them downtrodden and lower and advocating for living situations that will keep them dependent. Isn't it weird how those self-fulfilling prophecies work? And isn't it strange that the group of people that I constantly talk about as being largely dangerous to the mental well-being of, good golly, most of America, are the ones that manage to create this type of cycle? Oh, but don't worry. There is no epidemic of depression, sadness, and suicidality in young men that needs to be addressed so that we can have more people happy. Not at all. None of that needs to be addressed, and we are certainly not finding people who are very, very vulnerable moving over to the right wing and therefore creating more people voting for these policies, therefore creating more people who are perpetuating this particular cycle of poverty and depression, and holy gosh and golly gee, I don't know how long I can keep that bit up. What a nice cycle. What a nice cycle it is. So the right wing doesn't help them either. What the right wing gets really good at is doing this. So Salem, if we agree that when the tax rate was 91% in America, that was one of the things that helped us create the middle class, that was one of the things that led to more financial prosperity for Americans, because we have a bracketed tax system, so people who are making under $100,000, they don't see 90% tax. That's not a thing they see. We agree that's a thing. Okay, but then we tell people who are poor that the reason they are poor is that the government is taking more of their paychecks and giving it to immigrants. So what do those people do? They vote for politicians that do not want, that will advocate for lowering tax rates. Those tax rates are only really affecting the people who are hyper rich, but you don't see that. Most people don't see that. Most people don't think that far ahead. The politicians know that, and so they know how to use their rhetoric to convince their base that, hey, if we lower the taxes, we're going to make certain that you, as a person, are better taken care of, because you will have more of your paycheck, despite the fact that, yeah, getting like 3% extra on your paycheck, even when that happens, isn't really affecting your living situation all that much. I'm sorry, it's just not. So, then you take that person who sees everything around them falling to shit, but they don't know it's falling to shit because the taxes happen, because the taxes mean they have more money in their pocket. So despite the infrastructure around them falling to shit, they should be able to afford more of that. And then the right's rhetoric of personal responsibility kicks in. Oh, don't worry, you don't have enough money now because you're not doing your part. You're not doing your best. You need to work harder. And then people start to feel more and more useless. And then that expendability we've talked about before that is aiding in this epidemic of people who are lonely, who just happen to be on the male end of the spectrum, that increases. That gets exponentially bigger. The pull yourself up from your bootstrap situation happens. Oh, don't worry. It can simultaneously be the left's fault for advocating for higher taxes and also your fault for not pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Combine that together and you get the current state of things. And it's such a fucking convenient cycle for them to use, isn't it? It's really, really great if you're a conservative pundit or politician that has financial gain in here. I live in the district of Marjorie Taylor Greene. Do you know how many people work in construction in this district? A decent chunk of them. Do you know how many people who work in construction work in unions? A decent chunk of them. Do you know what Marjorie Taylor Greene's campaign slogan was for the longest time? Stop socialism now. Did you know that creating unions is a largely socialistic idea because it gives more power to the workers? What a strange coincidence, then. What a weird scenario that a whole bunch of people who are largely union workers will then vote for the person who would faster advocate for union busting. But, Nakibri, we went over that literally earlier in the video. The rates of suicidality are higher among men. The rates of having close friends are lower among men. The rates of having any friends are lower among men, and they've been going down lower, lower, and lower. It's not that this doesn't affect women as much on the whole. It's that we as a society have cultivated a standard where men look for attractiveness and women look for financial viability and emotional availability. And then we've created a world where men are not able to be as financially viable because we start just eliminating the middle class, and men are not as emotionally available because toxic masculinity is a hilarious thing that fucks everything up. But this is where I get to find everybody in my comment section yelling at me at the end of this video. Let's see how that goes. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you haven't already, and subscribe if you haven't already. And insert end of video tagline here.